member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm very, very glad to speak in support of this bill, and I welcome the timeliness and substance and responsiveness of the Minister for the Arts in his delivery of a new national cultural policy, which was well overdue. This bill is one of the first steps in the implementation of that policy, and the policy is called Revive, and it's appropriately titled, but should be a matter of sober and even in some ways sad reflection that we call it Revive, because it tells you something about where arts and culture and creative industries are at in this country. They are not in a good place, and that's a terrible shame, and it's a loss. It's a loss for all of us. It was lovely hearing the member for Indi talk about all of the various different kinds of art activities and organisations and arts workers in her community, and I think we could all tell that story. And in fact, I think it would be a good thing for people that represent 151 electorates around the nation to spend some time actually trying to sort of itemise and understand by category the different kinds of organisations, cultural and arts organisations, if they don't already know, because it is unfortunately still an under-regarded part of life in Australia. I think it is part of a kind of an anti-intellectual streak that is perhaps the unfortunate consequence of having a kind of an egalitarian culture where we tend to lean into sports and other kinds of physical endeavour, and there's been a bit of a tendency through our time to think that arts and culture is perhaps not down to earth enough, that it's sort of something that you do as an added extra, that you do as an indulgence, that people do as a matter of personal predilection, rather than arts and culture being actually one of the most important things about being humans, and certainly one of the most important things about human communities in so many ways. And we rush too quickly to try to justify arts and culture and creative industries and their workers economically. And again, that tells us something else about our tendencies, that unless we can find a way of saying this has economic importance, we feel like we can't make a convincing argument as to why it's important more generally. And that's stupid, you know. I think most of us know in our lives that the most important things aren't the things that can be quantified or that have economic value. And you could take health as an example. I mean, it doesn't matter how many assets you have or how much money you have. If you don't have your health, you've got nothing. And equally, if we didn't have all of the rich forms of cultural activity in our lives, what would we have? What would be the point of a material life, or a material life alone, if it wasn't for music and dance and stories, and of course these days film and gaming even. These are the things that really give life meaning, that help us understand our past and look to our future, that connect us, that are intrinsic to our identity, that help us shape the best form of our future selves. Arts, culture and creative industries are actually the most dynamic driver of all of those things, and frankly, if someone on reflection doesn't recognise those as the most important things, I'd be very, very surprised. What this bill does, as I say, it's a sort of first instalment of a long project, the Revive project, and it transfers the functions of Creative Partnerships Australia to the Australia Council, which will be known as Creative Australia in future. It shifts $15.2 million in funding across from 23-24 for 3 years, and then there'll be $5 million in annual funding that's applied to the Creative Partnerships piece, that's indexed and is ongoing from 2026-27. But as the Minister has explained, it's the first step in trying to give arts and cultural workers and enterprises a fair go, and it's the first step in repairing a lot of damage that's happened in recent times. That damage began before the pandemic. It's another thing that I think we have to be wary of, is this a bit of lazy thinking that looks at some of the circumstances we face and says, well, that was the pandemic. You can talk about You know, some people will say, perhaps on the other side, $1 trillion worth of debt. Well, that was the pandemic. Of course, the debt had been doubled before the pandemic. It was a third of it was added after that. The same is true for what has happened in to the arts and cultural sector. It really kicked off around the time of the awful 2014 budget. The then minister pulled $100 million out of the Australia Council, literally defunded 62 arts organisations or 65 arts organisations overnight. Literally said, you know, you've previously been a recipient of 4-year funding under the Australia Council. Well, that's gone. Goodbye, good night. That was incredibly harmful. And then when you add to that the defunding and the demonisation of two of our greatest cultural institutions, the ABC and the SBS, that had a terrible impact as well, particularly on screen producers. And I say that as someone who has a very strong screen production industry in my electorate of Fremantle. So that happened before the pandemic, and then in the pandemic, partly the circumstances of the pandemic with the need to socially isolate and not gather together when we were controlling infection in the early days and not being able to move around Australia to the same degree, that had an impact that couldn't be avoided because that was part of the health response. But there were things that could have been avoided. The sort of the ineptitude in its construction of JobKeeper could have been avoided. It should have been foreseen that there are people who work in arts and cultural enterprises that were likely to be left out by the way that JobKeeper was set up, and that proved to be the case. So you had this, I was going to say double whammy, but you could say triple whammy. The first part of the whammy is that, unfortunately, in this country, arts and cultural workers aren't properly paid. So there are plenty of people who you can say aren't properly paid, and it's a failure of our economic system sometimes, and it's a failure of the market when you have people doing vital work on the front line in healthcare and aged care, places like that are not properly paid. It's no less of a tragedy that people who apply their heart and soul, all of their great skill and expertise to the production of cultural artefacts, that they are substantially underpaid. It has ever been thus in Australia. We need to do something about it. So that was the first whammy, and then the double whammy that followed was the COVID restrictions and the impacts of COVID, which couldn't be avoided, but then the response of government, which literally left tens of thousands of arts and cultural workers in the cold. And that did completely unjustified harm to people and arts enterprises at the time. Some of that harm will be lasting because there were people, particularly I'd say younger and mid-career artists, who were essentially forced to say, you know, I'm going to give this up. Like, I've got a gift. I'm a writer. I'm a poet. I'm a dancer. I'm a playwright. I'm a musician. I'm on the path of trying to make that work, which is hard enough. But now in these circumstances, I have to give that up. I have to go and become something else in order to survive. And it will take us some time to really measure what that harm was. And I think it was a terrible shame because in many instances where we have crises, it's arts and cultural workers that are often the first to step up and try to be part of that response. And I certainly reflected with some bitterness during the course of the pandemic when I saw how arts and cultural workers were being treated, that when the bushfires in the summer of 2018-19 occurred on the East Coast, which were awful, one of the first things that happened in the early part of 2019 is that musicians in my community joined with the Fremantle Arts Centre, a great cultural organisation, and put on a concert, 2 concerts actually, I think, to raise money to send to the eastern states. And in the end, I think it was about $100,000 that was raised over those 2 concerts, and musicians came and performed for free, and the promoter made their contribution free of charge, and all of those things were done simply to maximise the fundraising that could then be directed to people who'd suffered awfully through those bushfires. And it was called From Freo with Love. It was amazing to be there. It felt like it was exactly what you'd expect to see from Australian community at its best, coming together, doing something kind of creative and celebratory, but also sombre and reflective, considering the circumstances, and raising funds and saying to another community in another part of Australia, we're with you, we feel and understand your pain, and we want to make a contribution to your well-being. Unfortunately, when COVID came along, the same didn't happen in reverse. I mean, it happened at a local level because I know of plenty of people who made an effort to the extent that they could. The moment that you were able to go to a gig again in Western Australia, we were fortunate in our response that we probably had longer periods of time when we weren't subjected to lockdowns. And the moment that it was possible to go out and support live arts and culture, the community did that. And they did it not just to help out arts and cultural workers and enterprises at a time of need, but again, as I said before, because in the experience of the pandemic, it made us realise how important those parts of our lives are. So that's certainly something that I reflect on. But more broadly, Deputy Speaker, when we talk about an importance of a future made in Australia, when we say that we should make things here as a matter of self-sufficiency, and I think as a matter of pride in our productive capacity and in the things that are distinctively Australian, of course, making things in Australia has to include making stories and making songs and making dance performances and making screen products, movies and drama and children's television and games and all those things. They should be made in Australia, and not just, as we might say in other areas, as a matter of self-sufficiency, because frankly, there will be some things that we make. It could be a pencil. It's great if we can make pencils in Australia. I dare say we don't make pencils in Australia. Does it really matter if someone makes pencils better and cheaper than us? Probably not. Does it matter if we don't make songs and stories and dance performances and TV drama and children's drama in Australia? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does, because that is core to who we are, and we cannot protect and enhance and involve our identity, and we cannot understand ourselves and our past and shape our future if we don't have strong arts and cultural production in every area. So in addition to the fact that creativity is king, creativity is, or I should say queen, or gold. I could say creativity is gold. One thing that almost every piece of innovation and every meaningful kind of productivity will have to involve in future is creativity. And the people who are the best at what creativity involves as a human productive process are, of course, artists. And we don't use enough of that. We don't actually say to ourselves in lots of areas of life, let's get creative and let's involve the creatives, and we'd be better off if we did. Needless to say that our arts and cultural and creative industries are critical to innovation. They are also critical to some other areas of economic life in Australia, particularly our two biggest service exports, education and tourism. All of the surveys show that when students in other parts of the world are considering a study destination, one of the things that they look for is the broader cultural experience that they're likely to have. So there's no doubt that when we put our best foot forward artistically and culturally, we do a lot for our international education sector. The same goes for tourism, and these are it's incredibly significant that we've managed to get to the point where we have 2 service exports in our top 5 export earners or top 6 export earners, and they, again, post-COVID should become stronger in time, and you're not going to make international education stronger or tourism stronger without having a strong arts and cultural sector. So we believe very strongly that Australia should be a place that makes things, as I said, songs, stories, plays, screen drama, documentaries, all kinds of performance, all kinds of visual arts. It's essential to who we are. It is among the best things that we get to experience. The people who produce it are among the most important people in our society. They're not valued enough. We should value them more. We've begun on that path with Revive. There's a lot more to do, but I welcome this bill.